Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Gladys Akosua Serwah Akom Ankobrey will defend the academic thesis, "You can't limit yourself to one country: Mobility Trajectories and Transnational Engagements of Young Dutch-Ghanaians." May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is to you.
Highly esteemed Prorector, dear members of the Defense Committee and supervisors, dear family, friends, and colleagues, it's an honor to present to you today my PhD dissertation entitled, "You Can't Limit Yourself to One Country: Mobility Trajectories and Transnational Engagements of Young Dutch-Ghanaians." In the next 50 minutes, I will outline the most important findings of my research, as well as its main contributions. In today's world, a large number of young people in Europe have migration as part of their biographies, either because they migrated themselves or because at least one of their parents did. Many of these young people grow up regularly visiting their or their parents' country of origin. Mobility is this an important part of their lives. Interestingly, recent studies show that the so-called second generation, so the children of immigrants, that they do not engage less in such travels, as is often assumed. In fact, they travel even more frequently to the country of origin than the first generation youth. This tells us that people do not necessarily cut ties to their so-called homeland as time passes. And this is framed as a huge problem in political debates in Europe. Ongoing engagement with the country of origin, including trips, would come at the expense of young people's integration in the country of origin, in the country of residence, and it also deviates from the norm, and the norm is immobility. So in this case, it means that young people would only stay in one place after they or their parents migrated to the country of residence. But this conception of mobility is overly simplified and does not do justice to the experiences of young people with a migration background. Aside from migration, they engage in back and forth movements between the country of residence and origin for short trips and longer stays. And this is where the concept of mobility trajectories comes in. This concept captures all the moves a young person makes in their lifetime, as well as the changing family constellations that may result from this. It emphasizes that mobility not only happens once, but it can happen at different points in time, and this can also coincide with important life stages, such as the shift from youth to adulthood. The mobility trajectory approach not only makes it possible to get an overview of young people's mobility, as a history of mobility, but also to capture the different purposes of trips and how they vary over time, from family visits as children to internships and volunteering as young adults, for example. And when they engage independently, this does not necessarily mean that they return or that they migrate to the country of origin, as is often assumed in the literature. And this overlooks the importance of trips. As Ama, one of my research participants, puts it, "You can't limit yourself to one country. I want to live here, but also there." So young people actually rather wanted to keep one foot in each of the two countries through their back and forth movements. But what actually happens during young people's trips? And how do these experiences, and particularly the emotions that young people face, how does it impact their lives? To address this research puzzle, I raised the following research question. How do young Dutch-Ghanaians' mobility trajectories shape their transnational engagements as they enter into adulthood? And in this study, I defined transnational engagements as participation in activities that link the country of residence and the country of origin. And this is not fixed, but it can evolve along with their mobilities. To investigate my research question, I spent time with 36 participants aged 14 to 25 in their everyday lives in the Netherlands, as well as during their trips to Ghana. And it took place over a period of 17 months. By following their mobility as it happened, so during trips, I also, and also by conducting interviews both before and after trips, I was able to document the emotional aspects of young people's experiences during trips and also gain a more processual understanding of their transnational engagements. I also use different mapping tools to document their mobility trajectories. So this research is part of a larger international project called Mobility Trajectories of Young Lives, which focuses on how mobility trajectories affect the lives of young people of Ghanaian background who live in Ghana, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. I focus on the case of young people of Ghanaian background in the Netherlands, and more specifically in The Hague, which holds the second largest Ghanaian community in the country. People of Ghanaian background in the Netherlands and in the diaspora in general often form organizations that connect them to Ghana. And they also engage in regular back and forth movements between their country of residence and Ghana. And this makes Dutch-Ghanaians the ideal case study. The first chapter, first I want to mention that I will outline the main findings of my chapters, of my thesis chapters, the empirical chapters. Each focuses on different aspects of young people's trips. The first chapter focuses on young people's experiences of attending funerals in Ghana. You may wonder, why funerals? Well, previous research has established that funerals offer a key opportunity to nurture transnational ties. Migrant background youth experiences of these events, however, have received very little attention. In fact, young people are often approached as people who rely on their parents when it comes to being transnational. In this chapter, funerals provide a lens through which I explore how young people develop their own transnational engagements. Funerals are one of the most important life cycle events in Ghanaian society. They bring together extended families and communities, and as well as diverse expressions of art. As such, funerals allowed participants to learn about family and cultural practices of membership. Yet, young people were not simply in touch with these cultural practices and family practices through adults, as is often emphasized in the literature. They rather learned by observing and embodying them. For example, young people learned about the cultural significance of crying and the use of specific gestures while doing so. These processes of learning and meaning making are not straightforward, but often also actually involve dealing with tensions and sometimes even gave rise to mixed feelings. One of the key findings of this chapter is that this did not actually necessarily result in decreased transnational ties, as is often implied in the literature. On the contrary, what I found is that young people rather drew on their mobility experiences, both from the past and the present, to make sense of these complex emotions and create new forms of engagement that suited their own interests. Relationships with other young people, peers, have been largely overlooked in the literature, but they play an important role in this process by inspiring and enabling young people to act on their shifting interests, which often meant exploring Ghana beyond family settings, as tourists, for example. While building on this, chapter 5 and chapter 6 look at two distinct forms of engagement that young people build with their peers through mobility. While chapter 5 explored how transnational engagements emerge, chapter 6 sheds light on how these engagements persist. I do so by examining what it is that motivates young people to invest time, resources, and energy into development activities in Ghana, and why they do so over time. And this addresses an important gap in the literature. Most studies focus on the impact of diaspora's contributions to the development of their country of origin, with very little investigation into the question of why they actually decide to do so over long-term commitments. Using a mobility trajectories approach, this analysis takes us from the place in which young people live to the places of their development activities and back. This enabled me to show how development activities, or the idea of doing development work, which young people refer to as giving back, is celebrated in the social context in which young people are embedded, including peer groups, also religious communities, and the wider diasporic community. During these moments of giving back, young people experience a mixture of emotions, ranging from disappointment when a project failed, for example, to feelings of pride when they receive praise for their work. Although challenges sometimes tested young people's sense of motivation, their experience generally contributed to a renewed sense of purpose and also intentions for more intense transnational engagement. One of the key findings is that transnational engagement is not merely determined by ethnic background, as previous research often emphasizes, but by development activities that occur throughout mobility trajectories, as well as by youth culture and religious culture. This chapter also brings greater attention to the critical role of emotions. I argue that emotions are not merely individual, but that they are relational. They intensified as they spread among groups of young people, resulting in a collective focus on giving back. Finally, while each of the empirical chapters draws attention to peer practices, Chapter 7 pays closer attention to how transnational engagement shifts by focusing on young people's participation in leisure. Previous studies have revealed the importance of this activity in the ways in which young people create social belonging when they enter into adulthood. Yet they usually only study this in the context in which young people live, so in the country of residence. This chapter investigates the ways in which participation in leisure practices during trips to Ghana, how it impacts young people's intimate relationships to the country. First, this chapter highlights the importance of studying young people's transnational engagements in relation to changes in the country of origin. While young people's activities during trips in earlier stages of their lives were often mostly limited to family context, new developments in Ghana turned the country into a popular and attractive leisure destination for young people, for many of my participants, and also the wider diaspora. This made it possible for them to visit new places, such as luxury resorts, but also lounge bars and and also music festivals. And this enabled new modes of feeling and being in the country. Second, in exploring these alternative sides of Ghana, participants drew on connections they had built throughout their mobility trajectories, including with friends from a Ghanaian background friends from the Netherlands, as well as same generation family members and from Ghana and also romantic partners from Ghana. My findings suggest that participation in leisure, which involves intense forms of socializing, that it helped young people, that it facilitated their ability to establish and maintain intimate relationships with these peers. And these relationships were often based on belonging to the same age group and common interests, rather than only on ethnic or family ties, which is often the focus in the literature. As such, this chapter moves away from dominant portrayals of the country of origin as an unchanging place that is solely for reconnecting with family and roots. It also draws attention to the often overlooked intersection between transnational mobility and shifts from youth to adulthood. To conclude, this dissertation provides a detailed account of the relationship between trajectories and young people's transnational engagements. A trajectory approach considers all moves a young person makes in their lifetime and understands these moves as interlinked. This enabled me to show how transnational engagements transform through mobilities, and more specifically through the life course, and in response to critical life events, funerals, more specifically, as well as through changing circumstances in the country of origin. Rather than fixed, transnational engagement should thus be seen as a process and not as something that is either absent or present. And also, particular attention must be drawn to what happens, what transpires during young people's trips. Because by centering young people's voices and also by following their journeys as they unfolded and at different stages, I was able to capture the emotional processes underlying their evolving transnational engagements and also their agency as they move. Finally, the emphasis on young people's mobility directs our attention to characteristics that affect their lives other than ethnic backgrounds alone. As mobility is an important part of the lives of young people with a migration background, it seems even more crucial to consider the role of mobility and how it enables them to maintain connections to more than one country as they build a future for themselves. Thanks for your attention. I would now like to give the floor back to, or give the word to the pro-rector.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Leonie Kolnips, Professor of Language Culture in Limburg, Maastricht University. The floor is to you.
Dear candidate, I'm the first one to congratulate you with your wonderful thesis. Thesis is well written. I have read it with much pleasure. And it provides crucial and urgent perspectives on social, cultural, and place-bound identifications of Dutch youngsters with a Ghanaian migrant background. And to me, what has become very clear from your thesis is that mobility and circulation should be given a central place when trying to understand how these youngsters orient themselves when growing up, especially from the youth and then transition into adulthood. Of course, I'm also here to ask you some critical questions. And I really admired your trajectory mobility approach, but I was also wondering, could you elaborate on which knowledge you gained in co-creation with your participants? So you could also have chosen for a more, let's say, a dialogue approach in which the youngsters could maybe decide what kind of methodology to choose. For instance, the vignettes written more by the youngsters instead of you. So did you consult them in the knowledge you have gained, and did you change some perspectives or viewpoints on the basis of how the youngsters give back information to you? So I'm very curious to hear more about this.
Highly esteemed opponent, thanks for your kind words and for this interesting question, which allows me to say a little bit more about the co-creation of knowledge with participants. So indeed, I include a lot of vignettes, and vignettes are a way for me to bring out young people's voices and also to give a sense of what young people experience during these trips. And you actually suggest that instead of me then being the one drafting these vignettes, that young people could also take part in this process. I have to say that in the context of my research, I was usually the one who was drafting these vignettes or writing these vignettes, and also I was the one who then came up with the final version of the vignette. But so in terms of writing, it was mostly me who was in control. And I also acknowledge in the introduction of the thesis that my own gaze, so my authorial gaze, cannot be ignored because I'm the one in charge of what is actually being presented about young people's lives. But in the context of field work, there was more flexibility also when in terms of how young people took part in the co-creation. So there were some core tools that we all designed as a modal team, and I also myself implemented certain tools that I thought would work best in my field site. But I also allowed young people to suggest which method they actually preferred using. So instead of me saying, oh, let's do an interview, I also often ask them, okay, but would you be interested in me joining in this activity, for example, doing participant observation instead of having interviews. So oftentimes what happened is that with certain participants, I only did interviews because it seemed to be more of their preference. And with other participants was actually mostly participant observation. And also if you look at the overview of the ethnographic activity per participant, you can also see this variation. So in the context of fieldwork, young people were very much also, not necessarily in that they co-created the knowledge, but they had some control in terms of which methods to choose, which also then brings me back to the youth-centric approach of this research, which really emphasizes sensitivity to young people's own needs and preferences, which then informs the type of methods that I use. And linking, also I have one final point about co-creation of knowledge. And this is maybe also nice to mention, is that at the end, towards the end of field work, me and also my other colleagues in the Motril team invited some of the participants in each of our field sites to take part in a storytelling workshop where they actually were able to write their own stories in their own way, which is then maybe a more direct way of co-creating knowledge with participants, although the emphasis was less on the co-creation aspect, but more on it was really about what young people themselves wanted to share. And I think that's maybe a nice way to end this answer. But I will, I hope this answers your question.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Tracy Reynolds, who is present online. Professor Reynolds is Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Greenwich. The floor is to you.
Hello there, Gladys. Congratulations, and I really enjoyed reading your thesis. I really liked your youth-centric and also the co-creation approach. And I wanted to just ask you about your own researchers' positionality. And I'm really interested to know how your own researchers' positionality informed the research process, including the research question, the research design, and also how you analyze the data. So really it's about you. I want to know more about you and how you were central to all of this.
Highly esteemed opponent, thanks for your compliments and also for this question about my own positionality in the field and how it informs the type of data that I was able to access. So in my methodology chapter, I elaborate on my position as a young woman, also a young woman of Ghanaian background, and also someone who, although I share a Ghanaian background with some of my participants, I didn't grow up in a Ghanaian community in the way that they did. So there was a sense of also being unfamiliar with certain cultural practices. And this was then actually also put me more in a position of learner. So not necessarily in, oftentimes when we talk about positionalities, like, are you an insider or outsider? So in a way you could say, okay, because I have a Ghanaian background, I could be maybe more seen as an insider, but at the same time, I was also an outsider because I'm not just Ghanaian. I also have a Dutch background, and I was also unfamiliar with certain practices that were important to young people, which actually had impact also in the ways in which I was able to access data. Because as I mentioned, as I also put myself in a position of learner, I asked a lot of questions also, and I think that's also why it's not a coincidence that I, for example, came up with the idea of the funeral, because that also is something that emerged as I was talking to young people in the field, and when they shared which cultural practices are meaningful to them. This is something that then drew my attention to funerals. And also, as I described in this chapter about funerals, as I was attending one funeral, I also asked a lot of questions, which maybe would be if you are maybe grew up in this community, would maybe be less of something that would be such a huge part of a research relationship. And maybe also what is also important to mention is, so I think the fact that my own trip to Ghana was such a formative experience for me. I think this also enabled me to create certain commonalities across differences. So as I mentioned also in the methodology chapter, as a young woman, it was sometimes more difficult to establish rapport with young men in my sample. So by having this experience of traveling to Ghana myself, and this being such a formative experience for me, I think this also helped me to overcome some of these hurdles without, of course, claiming that I'm now an insider, because I don't think that is possible to achieve. I hope this answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Hannah Heugner, lecturer in Education and International Development, University of East Anglia. The floor is to you.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I'd like to start off by congratulating you for having produced a really wonderful piece of work that was a pleasure to read, really engagingly written, with great vignettes that are very helpful in unpacking the themes that you then explore deeper. It's also really remarkable for the quality of the fieldwork, really in depth. It's very obvious that you managed to build very trustful and ethical relationships with your participants that then allowed you to gain really rich insights into their lives. So really very well done for all of that. And I could say a lot more, but I won't for the sake of time. My first question builds a bit on what Professor Reynolds asked you, hopefully, or follows up on that. And so my question is very much about race and how the meanings of race are constructed and experienced by your participants. And it's something you haven't touched upon yet. So it'd be great to hear more about that. So reading your work, I got a sense that the race and different constructions of what race means in different contexts were quite crucial to the experiences of your participants. In chapter 6 on development being a very racialized concept with a very colonial history, I felt that was somehow present also in your discussion in chapter 7 of experiences of beauty and attractiveness. And so I felt there were lots of really rich insights around the question of how race is socially constructed in different contexts, but you don't really foreground that much in your theoretical framing. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were, whether there was anything we could learn by paying more attention to these processes of racialization.
Esteemed opponents, thanks for this interesting question and also for your kind words. I think that indeed the construction of race is something that I only briefly touched upon, but I haven't really unpacked in this dissertation. But I think it is an important concept that I hopefully also will be able to work on further and develop further in potential future publications. But what I can say about this at the moment is that, indeed, I think also some of their transnational engagements cannot be seen as separate from how their understandings of race. So also, as I mentioned in chapter 6, that when young people travel to Ghana and engaged in these development encounters, that oftentimes that this was also, they received praise and also oftentimes it was in contrast to how young people were treated themselves in the Dutch educational system. And I think it's also good to mention that a lot of times young people were categorized as Black within Dutch educational system. So sometimes also as Ghanaian and the African background stood out, but also their Blackness was something that stood out, especially when they were in higher educational tracks where there is less representation of young people with a migration background and especially Black students. But I think that, something that is important to mention here is that in these classrooms, a lot of times they were confronted with racial stereotypes about Africa and about Ghana. And these negative experiences then also was shared among the groups of young people of Ghanaian backgrounds in the field site. And this actually also was explained some of their interest in going to Ghana, traveling there, and seeing how these stereotypes were actually challenged as when they were actually present in Ghana, and saw that, well, what people understand as Africa or Ghana as like a poor country, which is underdeveloped, is actually not the whole story. There is a lot going on there that actually challenges this idea. And this then also, I think, informed the ways in which they understood themselves, or they gained another understanding of their own position as Black Ghanaian subjects. So this actually Ghanaian and Blackness is, it's interlinked. So I think it can also not be seen as separate in the context of my research.
Thank you so much, and congratulations once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Bilisuma Dito, Assistant Professor of Globalization and Development Studies at Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidates, dear Gladys, congratulations on a well-written PhD thesis. I enjoyed reading it and got inspired by it. I appreciate your research because it successfully engages with rich bodies of literature. To mention a few, literature on second-generation transnationalism, mobility trajectories, life cycle events, youth studies, literature on return mobilities, and literature that links development encounters with migration, and literature on peer practices related to young people. And tying all this literature, you arrived at a framework to understand the link between the mobility trajectories and transnational engagements of young people of Ghanaian background. And you teased out the agency of these young people. And your thesis reaffirms the call for understanding young people's lives from their own perspectives. And congratulations on that. So my question is a continuation of Professor Reynolds' questions on positionality. In chapter 4, page 80, you explain your own positional trajectories. You argue that through time, however, I became more competent at performing Ghanaianness. And I would like to ask you 2 questions related to this. What does it mean to be competent at performing a specific culture? In this case, Ghanaianness. How is this different from being Ghanaian? The second, the ethical dilemmas or boundaries of developing such competencies to perform a specific culture as a methodological tool. Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for this interesting question and also for your kind words. Indeed, in the methodology chapter, I mentioned that performing Ghanaianness was part of my way of learning in the field side. So also maybe to link back to what my response to Hannah, that I put myself in the position of learner, and that by doing so, I learned more about not just like more on a content level, like, oh, what does this practice entail, but also how to behave at a funeral, for example, how to behave in a Ghanaian church setting, which is also different from maybe a church setting that is like a Dutch church setting, for example. Of course, the Ghanaian churches are also Dutch because they're in the Netherlands, but yeah, this is usually, these churches are dominated by people of Ghanaian background. So I think in this methodology chapter, when I mentioned this performing Ghanaianness, I also use quotation marks because I don't want to create this impression that there's like one way of acting Ghanaian. Of course, there are so many different ways in which young people in the field also perform Ghanaianness. So it was more a way for me to make this argument about my learning process in the field, but I don't want to create the impression in any way that there is like a centralized idea of what it means to be Ghanaian and how to perform Ghanaianness, because also my whole group of participants is not homogeneous. They are, a lot of them were Akan, but they also have come from different ethnic groups within Ghana, for example, which also then then this also challenges the idea of there's one Ghanaian way of being and acting.
Could you maybe say something about the ethical aspect?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the ethical aspect. Could you please elaborate on this question?
So I was wondering about, because I understood performance in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
What are the ethical dilemmas or boundaries associated with performing a certain culture as a methodological tool, maybe to access the field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Esteemed opponent, thanks for the clarification. I think it's if you see performing Ghanaian as a way to gain access, and then maybe this also creates the idea that you act in a certain way just for the sake of gaining access, that it could be seen as a problematic thing, because it only serves your purpose as a researcher to gain this knowledge. But I think this is also maybe something you cannot avoid when you conduct ethnographic field work. It actually really entails trying to become part of a community. Of course, you can never become a full insider, but you try to learn by doing, which also then entails asking questions about why do people do what they do, and trying to make the unfamiliar familiar. So I think if you try to perform Ghanaianness in a certain way, that this should not be seen as that this should come from a genuine interest, of course, and not just something that helps me to advance my career, for example, and treat the participants in a respectful way by doing so. And I think this is also maybe links to a point I wanted to make about the nature of ethnographic research. I mentioned that I was often asking a lot of questions, but there's also, of course, the youth centricity that also helps the researcher to also know, okay, when is the time to stop asking questions? And this is then, it really relies on knowing the participants. That you get to know a participant through time, so you also know when to do what, when to ask a question and when not to ask a question. So to treat it in a respectful way, I think is important. And I hope this answers your questions about the ethical dilemmas around.
Yes,
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Maaike Kaag, Professor in Anthropology of Islam in Africa and its Diaspora, University of Amsterdam. The floor is to you.
Thank you. Thank you, dear candidates, and also congratulations from my part. I really enjoyed reading your thesis. It's very rich and also very, very well written. And I think what it shows is that with your in-depth ethnography and the kind of diachronic approach that you're taking, and taking tensions in people's lives seriously and use them as a kind of explanation of changes, that's very, very useful and very interesting. And I know this is the rich part of your thesis, the kind of your focus on personal experiences and personal stories. But still, reading your thesis, sometimes I felt the need to have more in-depth analysis of the kind of the Dutch policy and political culture context. And you do this quite well for the education part, but not at a more general level. For instance, there you say at some part that in Antwerp, for instance, young Ghanaians do not have this kind of intense transnational contact with Ghana. And when you talk about development activities, you say, well, young Ghanaians in the Netherlands, they have more they do more in these hometown associations than in other parts, just for instance, in the US or in other European countries. So, and then you say, well, this is because in the Netherlands, there is this kind of, it's stimulated that you do this kind of development, co-development activities. And so it's a kind of very positive explanation. But I think it's more, there is more to say about it. And I think it partly links to the issues of racism, or what's racism, what's race. So maybe you can elaborate a bit more on this. And I was also thinking about Halle Garachi's thesis, who looks at Iranian women in the Netherlands and in the US. And she says, well, in the US, Iranian women can be both American and Iranian, while in the Netherlands, they're just Iranian, which makes a difference for their life trajectories or how they feel about it. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, highly esteemed opponent. Thanks for this interesting question and for your compliments. Could you maybe specify the final question about racism?
No, it's more on the influence of the Dutch context for these the trajectories of your participants, yeah, and the choices they are making.
Yeah, highly esteemed opponent. Thanks for the clarification. Indeed, in my background chapter, or in the methodology chapter rather, I refer to collaborative teamwork, and that while being in a team and actually sharing some of our observations from the field sites, that this is how I learned that there was something particular about my case study. Because in my case study, young people were often very much involved in development activities. And this wasn't, it took place, I think, in some of the other field sites, but not to the extent as in my field site. So I give the example of the Antwerp case, where young people also are less mobile than in my field site, for example. And this indeed drew my attention to what it is about the Dutch case. And I then mentioned that the opportunity structure, meaning also the type of programs that are offered to the diaspora to engage in co-development, for example, that this is very much present in the Netherlands. But I don't want to by any means state that this doesn't happen in other European countries. Actually, on the contrary, this notion of co-development is very much also encouraged in other European countries, and these development or diaspora engagement policies are actually very much similar. So I think it's good to clarify that I don't want to make it seem as if this is only particular to the Dutch case. But what I do find interesting, and this links to a study that I cite in my methodology chapter, which indicates that the Dutch Ghanaian population is highly organized compared to several other European countries and also in the US. So I think this is something that I would look into more. So I cannot really give like a clear explanation as to why this is, but I think this is indeed something that I want to follow up on in future publications. And you also mentioned, or you also asked a question about racism and how this then also informed young people's transnational engagements, if I understand you correctly.
Well, it was more kind of linking back to the other question, because I think if you look at, for instance, how migrant communities are integrated in the Netherlands, or have the opportunity to become integrated, or the ways they are kind of welcomed, have also an impact on the ideas of how they go about questions about race and engagements with the country of origin.
Yeah.
So it was not a specific question on racism.
Yeah, but more a chance for me to elaborate. Thanks, highly esteemed opponent. I think, as I also described in the background chapter, that the way in which most Ghanaians were welcomed when most of them arrived, which was in like the late 80s. In the 80s, it was a very restrictive and hostile political climate. So although family reunification was something that drew a lot of people to the Netherlands, it was also around this time that a lot of policies became much stricter. And also, I think this experience of being actually categorized as the unwanted other and being the undeserving migrant, that was also very much present in public discourse. That this also affected how the Dutch-Ghanaian population, how they perceived also their opportunities in the Dutch context. And in this background chapter, I also give some examples of how of how Dutch Ghanaians, how they deal with these hurdles. Many of them actually use these transnational resources that they have, so access to family networks all over the world, so other Ghanaians in the diaspora, to also facilitate potential future moves. So I think this links then to the trajectory question, and to also link it to my own research participants. Something that often came up in the field side is that while the Dutch educational system is very hierarchical and really offers or makes it very difficult for many young people to move upwards, that the UK educational system, for example, was seen as less hierarchical and therefore also seen as a potential country where they could move to improve their social status. So, and this was also often based on the presence of other family members who were already living in this country. So this, I think the trajectory approach also allowed me to not only focus on young people's connections to the Netherlands and Ghana, which is the central focus of my research, but it actually also allowed me to see what other connections young people have to other family members in other countries, and how that then also enabled them to resist some of the discriminatory racism that they experience in the Dutch context. Thank you.
Were you satisfied with the answer?
Very much, thank you.
Well, I think we still have time for a second round of questions, not a full round, but just a few more questions. Perhaps Professor Kornips, would you like to ask a second question?
Dear candidate, I really admired your in-depth ethnography, and my other colleagues also mentioned that. And it makes me a bit longing when reading your dissertation about more of, to get more about the youngsters' experiences. And there are two issues that I'm really curious at, and I couldn't find it in your dissertation. The first one is the sensorial input when traveling from the Netherlands to Ghana. So how does it smell? How does it taste? So the whole transformation of the whole trajectory, what happens on the way with all the senses in one way, and the other one is, so how does it look like linguistically? So I'm a linguist, so I'm very much eager to know how we know that language is put in use, for instance, for linguistic ordering or identification processes or identification processes. So how did you? I think that the respondents didn't speak all the languages that you do, and vice versa. And in Ghana, they have to they have to do an appeal on a different set of language than in the Netherlands. So can you comment on that? Would you elaborate on these two? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thanks for these interesting questions, which also allow me to say a little bit more about the sensorial aspect of young people's mobility experiences. Indeed, I think when it comes to their mobility experience, I very much focused on their trip to Ghana as a whole, and not necessarily on the the act of moving from place to place. And this is something that other mobility scholars have paid quite some attention to. And I think it also gives richer insight into also some of the expectations that young people have, like how do they feel when they arrive in Ghana, for example. What does it say about how they, what their idea is about this particular trip, what their expectations are, as I mentioned. And something that often came up in some of my interviews is the moment that they arrived at the airport in Ghana, so Accra Airport, which is renovated. And this was actually something that where young people often commented on, that this is about their experience of being in this space, and also what this then, it also often reminded them of the fact that, whoa, our country is actually changing. It's not what people understand it to be like, because we see that when you arrive at this airport, everything works very smoothly. It's basically like an airport in any other country, like in any other European country, but this is often not what people think when they think about what is going on, or about the Ghanaian context, for example. So so this was more about their also sensorial experience, and also feeling the heat of the sun on their skin, and how this is so different, of course, from their experience in the Netherlands. But also being surrounded by people that often looked like them, how that also created more like a sense of belonging in a way, which I didn't touch upon really, because this is something that is very very well actually discussed in the second generation returns literature, like how do young people experience these trips in terms of their sense of belonging, and not necessarily the sensorial aspect, but more so about what it does for their sense of identification. So I think about the sensorial aspect, I think maybe this is also the act of moving from place to place, how it achieves meaning and significance. I think this is worth exploring further. So thanks also for bringing this up. And your second point about the multilingual aspect, so maybe it's good to clarify that I spoke often Dutch and English with participants. So usually Dutch, but sometimes it was also a mixture of Dutch and English. Many young people in my sample actually spoke the official language in Ghana, so they spoke Twi. Some of them also other local languages, but Twi, it was, sorry if I mispronounce it, I'm very much aware of how I pronounce things, but so this is also maybe for me also a moment to mention that I don't speak the language, so I also often mispronounce things, which makes me very self-aware, and it was also often a learning opportunity for me, which then links back to the question also about my positionality in the field, that because I didn't speak the language, the local language that many young people in my sample spoke, I often, this didn't necessarily form this was not necessarily a problem in the field side, but it did make me more like an outsider in certain contexts, especially when young people among themselves would use certain words which I couldn't follow. So then I would ask them about this, and this then also really confirmed my position as someone who is kind of Ghanaian, but not fully. So I think I'm not sure if this answers your question.
Fair enough, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Reynolds, there is still an opportunity for you to ask your second question. Please, the floor is to you.
Thank you. Just to add, it was such a beautifully written thesis. Just to add that, I really, really enjoyed reading it. And it made me think about your conceptualization of youth. And I felt oftentimes it was represented as a homogeneous category. And I'm interested to know whether it changed according to context, so how youth was defined in Netherlands compared to Ghana. Was it something which was self-defined? Was it related to the life cycle? So maybe if you could just unpack your conceptualization of youth for me.
And thanks for this additional question. I think it's indeed important to mention that the category of youth is constructed. So of course it doesn't, there's not one meaning that applies in each of the different contexts in which I spend time with young people. So for example, so in the Netherlands, there were certain ideas about what does it mean to be young, and in Ghana there are also certain ideas around this, which sometimes also created some friction. And to give an example, in chapter 7 of my thesis, I describe young people's experiences of exploring Ghana on their own, and oftentimes also in when it came to their opportunities to venture on their own, they were often also faced family restrictions. So family members also from Ghana who restricted their movements, which was, and also oftentimes that young people told me that they were more likely to be seen as a child, while in the Netherlands they had, in certain cases, they had more freedom to roam, to actually explore or to just venture outside. So I think having also this understanding of how youth changes according to the context is
You can finish your answer.
Yeah, so thank you. I wanted to mention that having this understanding of youth as a constructed category, which is not fixed to a certain age category, also helps us to think about what methods do we use when we work with young people, because often there's this idea of, oh, let's use participatory methods because this works for young people, but this is not necessarily the case when you think about how, yeah, young youth is a construction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gladys Akosua Serwah Akom Ankobrey, the time appointed for defending your thesis has come to an end. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. Thank you. Gladys Akosua Serwah Akom Ankobrey, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Matsukato is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with the Dutch University custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I do.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Gladys Akosua Serwah Akom Ankobrey, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Congratulations. Dear Dr. Akom Ankobrey, dear Dr. Gladys Akosua Serwah Akom Ankobrey. Doesn't that sound beautiful? Yes. Now, folks at home, you realize that you're going to have to refer to her like this from now on. Dr. Gladys Akosua Serwah Akom Ankobrey, or Dr. Akos, also fine, maybe. Now today, Gladys is Act 3. And for those of you who were at Sarah's and at Laura's defenses on Monday and Wednesday, you know what I'm referring to. Gladys, you have been one of the 6 fundamental members of the Motrel team. You, together with the 3 other PhDs, a postdoc, and myself, have worked together for the past 5 years. And I have to say, it has been such a pleasant, cooperative, and stimulating experience working with the 5 of you. Together, we developed the research program on transnational youth mobility, the theoretical and conceptual framework for this project, the tools we use to collect the information. Together, we read each other's field notes and helped with the interpretation. We shared analyses and co-authored articles and book chapters. Secretly, I've always called you guys the dream team. As I mentioned at Sarah's and Laura's defenses, we worked together as a team, but you also produced individual works, bringing your own passions and insights into your theses. And I think the whole research project, as I said before, is a play in 4 acts, in which each act is one of the PhDs, their projects, and together the 4 acts make the whole story. And today we have Act 3, and Act 3 is called Gladys. Gladys. Also for you, I went back to my interview notes when you applied for this job, and I wrote, interesting and radical thinker. And I think this is reflected in our team as well. You were always the one who always asked the questions. You asked lots of questions, not just to your research respondents, but also to us. And your questions were of a clarificatory type, but also questions that made sure that we thought through all of the ethical dimensions of interacting with young people of Ghanaian European backgrounds. And your positionality, which we talked a lot about actually today, was a strength for our project. Sometimes you struggled with your insider-outsider positioning in the field. Having a Ghanaian father, you were often seen as one of us by your research participants, which led to you being asked to do many things for the community that could potentially derail you from your thesis activities. At the same time, your sense of duty towards the community and towards your respondents made you feel like you had an obligation to help out. You navigated this delicate position with great tact and care and worked your way into diverse communities of Ghanaian background young people in The Hague. You were able to collect incredibly rich data, which again, all of the committee members have commented on young people's relationships with their Ghanaian roots, their romances and leisure activities during summer vacations in Ghana, their development activities, wishing to give back to Ghana. And interestingly, sometimes you found yourself collecting data on things that you were experiencing yourself. Your positionality contributed to our team discussions because we could note and analyze how being differently positioned in the field reveals different insights. As I said, the things you studied at times resonated with your own personal experiences. So who knows? Maybe the future holds an autoethnography for you. If you do write one, I'm going to be your first reader. You came back from the field with incredibly rich data, and sometimes it was a struggle to decide which aspects to focus on in your thesis, precisely because you had so much. And every time you would meet with Lauren, your co-supervisor, and myself, our discussions would reveal even more details and knowledge that you had from the field than what you put down on paper. Our job was really to extract from you all the things that you knew, but that you took for granted sometimes. I speak for both Lauren and I think, when I say that we were always so impressed with the richness of your data that you brought into the discussion. And putting it into an analytical story was a challenge, but you always pulled through. And you've made important contributions to the literature, Gladys. Here, I just want to take a moment to pause and also to thank Lauren for her co-supervision. Lauren, Gladys is your first PhD. And I'm happy to have asked you to be on the supervision team. I want to emphasize that I really admire your pedagogical skills in helping students to think through their own ideas and to bring out the kernel that makes these ideas engage with the literature. I think these are exemplary skills. So I'm very happy that I asked you to be a co-supervisor. Now we're going back to Gladys because Act 3 is called Gladys. This PhD has been a great journey and your achievements are nothing but remarkable. 2 published papers in very good international academic journals and 1 in the review process. We also co-authored a book chapter together with the Motril team. And you can be very, very proud of this, Gladys. I'm sure there were moments of struggle, as every PhD has, yet your calm and composed demeanor almost made it seem like you sailed seamlessly through it. Even these last months, when you had to prepare the final published manuscript in half the time that is normally given to PhD students in order to have this defense in time before Lauren goes on maternity leave, you handled this with apparent ease. Now, I know that that's probably not how it felt inside. But your composure is something that I really wanted to mention because it's so characteristic of you. But I also want to acknowledge that I know that you had a lot of support from your family, your mom, Verena, your sisters, Hilary and Jura, and your dad, Gabriel, whose connection to Ghana you have followed. They did a lot to encourage that little girl living on the top floor of the apartment building in Utrecht, who looked out of the window in the middle of the night, asking herself what she might become. Your academic journey started and continued with their support, and you've come a long way. Gladys, it has been a true pleasure working with you, and I'm so glad to continue having your constructive and critical perspectives in our research project this coming year. But before I close, you know what's coming. I think some people in the audience also know what's coming. Just like with Sarah and Laura, I'm going to end on a cliffhanger. Because, dear audience, this is Act 3 of a 4-act play. On Monday, we had Act 1. At Sarah's defense, I ended with a cliffhanger. Today, together with the Motril team, this coming year, we're going to do something exceptional that I've never done before. At Laura's defense, Act 2, I continued this by saying, and this thing that we will do involves writing, but also something else, something completely unexpected. And today, I end Gladys's ceremony defense with Act 3 by saying, this unexpected thing will also take place in an unexpected place. And that is, please join us for Act 4. When Onalia Osei will be graduating, you will know how the cliffhanger ends. Dear Gladys, congratulations. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Gladys Akosua Serwah Akom Ankobrey, also on behalf of the Board of Deans, I congratulate you with the honor you have acquired. Congratulations, and we are all looking forward to Act 4, of course, and some of you may be joining us for this 4th act. We would like to take a picture together with you and the online professor and the committee. And I would like to ask the audience to move on and to already go to the reception, and we will be joining you in a moment. Thank you.